Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the City of Confusion, the Battle of Four-Way, Tet 1968 by High Flying Dice Games. In game components, there are nice looking counters. This is actually the unmounted counter sheet, which is just a very thin paper that accepts color very well. And what you're looking at the left here is the front side, and then this is the back side of the counters. And what you're also looking at are, the dark green is the US forces, the lighter green is the South Vietnamese forces, below there is the North Vietnamese forces. There's a second counter sheet. Here you go. And that grayish one is your guerrilla forces, your South Vietnamese army. And then you'll also note that there are air units for airstrikes, naval gunfire, and potential for a landing craft in the river. There's markers to denote victory points and activation markers, since not all units may activate at any given time. And also additional markers. These are pin markers, they're the slash lines, and then suppressed markers are the X line, X numbers. And there's rubble for rubbling the buildings or bridges, and then there's additional markers, and also the back view of this front side. The game has several charts. In terms of combat charts, you have your fire table. Probably one of the things I wish they did better was a larger font size, but this is the fire table. You have a Terran effects chart. They made it in a rather interesting format, rather straight read lines, but it looks very nice. Your activation chart. Units are activated, it's a card-driven system, so units are activated based on what cards are drawn. Turns are finished based on what cards are drawn. And then a unit summary and their capabilities. There's also a chart for recovery and replacements. Once units sustain damage and no longer are capable of fighting, they are removed from the playing board. There is a chance that those units that had casualties or routed out of the playing field may recover, may regroup, and form another fighting unit again and redeploy. So this gives you this option in the game. And then there's an initial setup. There's a turn sequence right there. There's up to 10 turns. And it shows you the location. There's also optional forces. Like if you look here, this is the optional forces for the North Vietnamese. And then here's one for the US forces. It introduced the air cav. And throughout the game, since the US are outnumbered, they are being reinforced. You can see the reinforcements coming in various turns of the game. And if you look at the actual turn sequence, it gives you the date and the period of when they are being reinforced. And the same thing here is that the North Vietnamese will be introducing their forces mostly on turn 2. And on this side is your victory point track. You can take casualties. You're going to keep track of the victory points. You have 1s, 10s, and 100 counters to monitor and count up the victory points. And here's also the additional of the other 5 turns in the game and the turn setup, turn 1 setup. So another chart which I talked about is the random events chart. And they put it in a very interesting format. Makes it There's 2 dice in the game, 2 6-sided dice and 1 10-sided dice that are used. In addition to the 2 card decks, including the jokers. The game comes with a rule book. This blue connector here doesn't come with the game, just the sheets of the rules. And here it is. They're one side only. As you can tell, they're full color. And we're looking at about, let's see, how many rules? About 10 pages of rules. And there's an additional page here. Let's see this. This is the actions taking event in unit elimination chart made in a very period feel format. Same additional with the other charts, there's a certain level of period feel to it. Puts you into the theme. So I'm going to zoom in on the map so we get a better look at it. Towards here is the actual historical fortress. You see the moat that surrounds it, fortified position. The Imperial Palace, that's probably one of the main objectives of the communist forces. Here's the airfield, which is critical. And here's the headquarters unit for the South Vietnamese Army. Over to this side, across the bridge, you'll see the Marine base, the post office, the Capitol, the hospital. The flag areas are the objective areas that also gives you victory points, and they need to be controlled. And then the bridges also are important. They can be destroyed. And this grayish, greenish color is the built-up areas. So what I want to continue with is the actual turn process and what's involved in the turn process. There's several parts of the turn. It's the initiative phase, the activation phase, the recovery phase, the replacement phase, and the game turn phase where there's a certain level of cleanup. Let's talk about the activation phase for starters. So I'm going to bring you in closer here. I've arranged the spread of these cards to help you understand the activation phase. For example, right here it's the U.S. forces. If a spade is drawn for the U.S. deck, then the infantry forces can move. The number of infantry forces is determined by the number here, in which the ace represents a 1. If a face card is drawn, then one of the indirect air units are used, and these are off board usually, and they enter the game and they could be used, or the naval gunfire from the U.S. forces. And the jack represents a 1, queen represents a 2, and king represents a 3, meaning that 3 air units, 2 air units, or 1 air unit, when drawn, can be activated. The same is true for the South Vietnamese forces. If a club is drawn, they can activate their infantry units, and if a face card is drawn, they can activate one of their air units, 1 or more of their air units, up to 3. 1 for the jack, queen, 2, king is 3. If any of the red cards are drawn for the U.S. South Vietnamese players, the activation switches to the communist side, and then they could draw the card. The North Vietnamese and NLF units, or the Viet Cong. Now note I placed the 10 of spades and the 10 of clubs sideways. What that means is that if this card is drawn, activation goes to here. Now, if subsequently the Northeast player draws also a 10, or here a 10, then the activation sequence immediately ends, and it goes on to the next part of the sequence. And so there's a possibility, like I said, there's 8 10s in the deck, so it's possible to get 2 in a row. When a deck is complete, you introduce one of these joker cards into your deck and then reshuffle. When that joker card is, and then you repeat the process. When that joker card is flipped, it goes to random events, and the random events will look something like this. And you'd roll basically 2 dice, 2 6-sided dice. You'll either get some sort of reinforcements of new reinforcements, or reactivation of this type of unit or this type of unit. These are South Vietnamese and this North Vietnamese. Or potentially add another joker to the deck. Now the activation sequence ends by 1, 2 10s are drawn in a row. 2, there's no more units to activate. They're all been flipped. Basically, when it's flipped, it looks like a red stripe. So all the units have been activated, and there's no more to complete. And 3, both players decide to end the activation. Now, once that is done, the turn will go to the next part, which is the recovery phase, replacement phase, and then the end of turn. Now, before I leave there, these cards, like I said, they switch over to the other player when flipped. However, they are used during the combat to resolve combat. So all these cards are used in some form. So the cards are used for activation. They also cards are used to resolve combat, which I will talk to in a moment. Now, to complete the activation of a turn, to complete the whole turn sequence, there is the recovery. That's if they got suppressed or units are in some sort of non-normal state. You have an opportunity to try to recover them. And then there's also the replacement phase, where units that were no longer combat effective and were eliminated, they could reform, regroup, recover casualties, and form another combat unit to be reintroduced into the game. So what I'm doing is showing you the details of the unit counters and what they represent. So to the upper left, let me see if I can point that out right here. Here, that's the combat factor. To the right, upper right, that's the movement. Bottom is the unit designations. And right here in that blue area that you see there, that's the unit size, which is about platoon size, between 30 to 50 men. This applies to all the units. There might be other indications like an H for heavy weapons. And as you can see, the unit IDs give a little more flavor in the game. It's not necessarily a rule mechanic, but it gives you a little bit more flavor in terms of what the units represent in the game. For example, there's an HQ unit. Here's the Elite Black Panthers unit. An armored unit. And here's some additional markers where you could rubble and or destroy a bridge. This is the pin marker, and this is the suppress marker. The pin marker adds a modification to their combat value, while the suppress marker meaning they can't do any type of combat. And that's represented, they could recover from those during the recovery phase. So the terrain in this game is regulated to different areas. One is the open area, 2 is the built-up area, you have a river, and the darker green here is the park area. It limits to what type of units can move, and also the river itself, which is not crossable except through the bridges, and the moats and canal areas here, which is limited mostly towards infantry type units to cross over. At the moment I have the counters scattered. I'll set up for their first term setup here in a moment. There is a chart to detail the movement limitations of each unit, and it's colorfully set up. give you a little more detail there. One of the more interesting units in the game is the NFL guerrilla units, or otherwise known as the Viet Cong. These units operate with the flip side concealed, and what that means is that they are basically undercover. The U.S. forces that moves around them has a +1 movement, restricting their movement due to sniper activity. They're limited in their combat capability. They can't engage in close assault against a unit. They can't engage in close assault, but they can be close assault. They cannot engage in one. But the benefit, though, is that when they are in a fire mode, there is no red side, so it's possible for them to be reactivated during the game turn. They also have the benefit of only a +1 zone movement even in the built-up areas, with only restriction that they can't move into a prohibited area. Now, so that gives you sort of a flavor of some of the special units in this game. There's probably a few more that I won't discuss in this review. So let's talk about combat. So combat in this game is resolved by cards. You first have to establish a hit, and I'll go through the combat results tables here in a moment, but before then, if you look at, let's say, the first number is the combat value. So in this case, above here is 4, and this one's done is a 2. It's done individually. You flip a card. In this case, the ace again represents a 1. So any number between 1 and 9 is the value of the attack. 10s are misses, and jack, queens, and kings, and also a joker are generally misses, or it might be some sort of events. You could check the tables for that. Now, as you can see, the goal is to have a low card. So, and a low card that's equal to or lower than the combat value of the target of the firing unit. Once you do that, you establish a hit on the unit. And from there, with addition of some target modifiers and firing unit modifiers, it'll adjust the value so it gets closer to this number. So ideally, you do want a low card, and as you can tell from this, depending on the combat, you can see the strength of the combat unit at this point. Like this will have a good attack factor, while this unit here may not. Now the other two markers I have here is the results, and I'll show you how you can obtain this. But generally, for firing between 2 zones, that's your fire combat. So I can fire between here and here. The general results with no heavy, just generally bullets and machine guns or lighter weapons, you're going to either suppress the unit or pin the unit. Pinning, which is this counter here, means the unit has a modifier to any type of combat. It does, and it's generally a +1. And the suppress unit, which is this unit here, counter, means that the unit that's actually suppressed cannot initiate any type of combat. There is a method to recover from that during the recovery phase. At the risk, though, first you have to pass a morale check, but at the risk of eliminating the unit altogether, whether it's pinned or suppressed. And with heavy weapon units, it's possible to eliminate the unit during fire combat. And if eliminated, there is also a possibility that they could reconstitute themselves, since elimination only means elimination of its combat capability, not necessarily that every man is killed. During the recovery phase, you have an option to try to recover that unit, but there is also, like I said, a penalty that it could be permanently removed if it's already been eliminated off the board. And here's a close-up of the combat results table that I just talked about earlier. And it gives you an idea what kind of results you get just to get a hit going. There are a series of modifications to the cards based on the firing unit and the target unit, which I've listed here. And then once you establish it, what the results could be. Now once you establish a hit, you could roll a 10-sided die and it'll tell you what type of result you get depending on the fire unit. Like I said, in this scenario, or at least in this particular game, firing between adjacent zones, like in built-up areas, is not going to provide that much of results in terms of elimination of the unit unless you're a heavy type of unit. Most likely you'll get either suppression of that unit or a pinning that unit. So for elimination of the unit, you have to move towards what is known as close combat, where you actually enter the same zone of your opponent. Let's put it in actual combat units here. Into the same zone as your opponent and do a close assault. In this case, you would refer to the close assault combat table. Apply the modifiers and see what the results are. So when the game is initially set up, game turn 1, you're going to see something similar to this. You do have some freedom of setup for the forces. In general, you'll most likely set up the South Vietnamese forces in the Imperial Palace, the airfield, and the South Vietnamese Army headquarters. U.S. forces are at the MAACV. NFL forces or Viet Cong forces have already taken objectives in the city, which include the post office, capitol, power station, hospital, etc. And they'll be racking up victory points there. North Vietnamese forces have already infiltrated the citadel, disguised as South Vietnamese army units and overpowering the guards. And right now they're laying siege and taking out the key objectives. This game starts out with superior forces by the North Vietnamese forces, but they will eventually be overpowered by the US and South Vietnamese forces due to their reinforcements and firepower. They do have the option, however, to bring in optional unit at the cost of victory points. In the case of the North Vietnamese forces, they could bring in the 324B Division on turn 3. They either could accept it at turn 3 or not at all. And the US forces have the option to bring in the Air Cav, either at this location, which is generally the prime location where US forces enter in, or on the north side, or they can enter in on the airfield if it is controlled by their forces. South Vietnamese forces also bring in reinforcements on the north side and on the west side. So this game is City of Confusion, The Battle of Hue Tet, 1968, by High Flying Dice Games. If you like this video, please give it a like and feel free to subscribe. Thank you for watching.